The boy stood on the auction block like a piece of furniture nobody wanted. Dirt caked his face in uneven patches, and his clothes hung loose on a frame too thin for 12 years of living. The crowd shuffled their boots in the dust, avoiding his eyes as the auctioneer's voice grew more desperate with each lowered bid. "Do I hear $5? $5 for a strong boy who can work." The man's voice cracked with embarrassment. "He's got good hands, good back. Ain't nobody want another mouth to feed," someone called from the crowd. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered townspeople. The boy's shoulders sagged, but his chin stayed up. He'd learned that much in the orphanage: never let them see you break. At a table near the courthouse steps, a cowboy sat with his hat pulled low, a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. He'd been watching the auction for an hour, studying the faces in the crowd more than the items being sold. When they brought the boy out, something shifted in his chest, a recognition he couldn't name. The boy had dark hair that caught the late afternoon sun, and eyes that held too much knowing for someone so young. But it wasn't his appearance that made the cowboy's breath catch. It was the way the child stood, straight back despite everything, proud despite having nothing. $2, the auctioneer pleaded. "Surely someone can spare $2. Silence stretched like a taut rope. The boy closed his eyes for just a moment, and in that gesture the cowboy saw something that nearly broke him. The child was preparing to be unwanted again. The cowboy had come to town for supplies, nothing more. His ranch was small, his bank account smaller. He had no business taking on responsibility for another human being. But as he watched the boy's hands clench into small fists, fighting back tears he refused to let fall, every rational thought abandoned him. He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden boardwalk. The sound cut through the uncomfortable silence like a gunshot. Every head turned toward him as he stepped forward, his boots echoing in the sudden quiet. The auctioneer looked at him with desperate hope. "Sir, are you bidding?" The cowboy's throat felt dry as sand. He looked at the boy who was staring at him now with guarded curiosity. In those dark eyes he saw something that made his decision for him, a flicker of hope the child was trying hard to hide. $5, the cowboy said, his voice carrying across the square. A collective exhale passed through the crowd. The auctioneer's face lit up like Christmas morning. $5, do I hear 6? But no one else spoke. They just stared at the cowboy, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. A stranger spending money on an unwanted boy raised questions in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The cowboy stepped closer to the auction block, close enough to see the boy's face clearly. The child was studying him with an intensity that seemed beyond his years, trying to read the stranger's intentions. Their eyes met, and for a moment time seemed suspended. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. "Wait." The voice came from behind the cowboy. Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd, his badge catching the sunlight. "We don't know this man. What's his interest in the boy?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The cowboy felt every eye on him, felt the weight of judgment settling on his shoulders. He could walk away now, disappear back to his ranch, and pretend this moment never happened. Nobody would blame him. "Name's Jake Coleman," he said instead. "I got a ranch about 20 miles north." "That don't answer the question," the sheriff pressed. "Why you want the boy?" Jake looked at the child again. The boy was watching this exchange with the wariness of someone who'd learned that adults' decisions usually meant disappointment. But there was something else there too, a quiet desperation he was trying to hide. "Every man needs help on his ranch," Jake said carefully. "Plenty of grown men looking for work," Sheriff Morrison replied. "Why a boy?" The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Jake felt sweat gathering under his collar despite the cooling air. He could lie, make up some story about needing an apprentice, but as he looked at the boy's face, at the hope and fear warring in those dark eyes, the truth came out in words he hadn't planned to say. "Because every boy needs a home." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You got references? Anyone who can vouch for your character?" Before Jake could answer, old Mrs. Henderson stepped forward from the crowd. "I know him," she said quietly. He's good people. Lost his wife 2 years back. Been keeping to himself since. The sheriff's expression softened slightly, but his duty remained. Boy's been through enough. Don't need him ending up somewhere worse than where he started. Jake nodded, understanding the warning beneath the words. He'll be treated right. Sold to Mr. Coleman for $5, the auctioneer called, bringing his gavel down with finality. As Jake paid the clerk and signed the papers, whispers started spreading through the crowd like wildfire. He tried to ignore them, but fragments reached his ears anyway. Strange him showing up just when the boy's being sold. Never seen him in town before. What kind of man takes in a stranger's child? The boy climbed down from the auction block and stood beside Jake, clutching a small burlap sack that seemed to contain everything he owned. Up close, Jake could see the child was trembling slightly, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "What's your name, son?" Jake asked quietly. "Tommy," the boy whispered. "Tommy Mitchell." Jake was about to respond when heavy footsteps approached from behind. He turned to see Sheriff Morrison and 2 other men, the kind who made their living with their fists rather than their brains. "Hold on there, Coleman," the sheriff said. "Got word from the county seat. They're looking for a man matches your description." Jake's blood went cold. What kind of word? Child gone missing from an orphanage up in Millerville. Boy about this one's age. The sheriff's hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Funny coincidence you showing up here just when we're selling an orphan." The crowd that had been dispersing suddenly pressed closer again, sensing trouble. Jake could feel their mood shifting from curiosity to suspicion, to something darker. In a town where children were precious and strangers were suspect, accusations like this could turn deadly fast. "I've never been to Millerville," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "That's what they all say." One of the sheriff's men stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Easy enough to check though. We'll just hold you until we can send a telegram." Tommy pressed closer to Jake's side, his small body rigid with fear. The boy had gone from unwanted to claimed to potentially lost again in the span of minutes. Jake could feel the child's trust, fragile as spun glass, beginning to crack. "Please," Tommy whispered, so quietly only Jake could hear. "Don't let them take me back." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Whatever this boy had run from, whatever had brought him to this auction block, he was terrified of going back to it. Jake looked down at the child's upturned face and saw his own reflection in those dark eyes, the reflection of someone who'd lost everything and was still fighting to survive. The crowd was growing uglier by the minute. Someone shouted about protecting their children. Another voice called for a rope. The situation was spiraling beyond the sheriff's control, and Jake knew that in another few minutes, questions of guilt or innocence wouldn't matter. He had to make a choice: run and confirm their suspicions, or stay and hope the truth would be enough to save them both. "Sheriff," Jake said, raising his hand slowly, "let me show you something." He reached into his vest pocket, moving deliberately so no one would think he was going for a weapon. His fingers found the worn leather wallet he always carried, and from it he pulled out a small photograph, creased and faded from years of handling. "This is why I came forward for the boy," he said, holding the photograph so the sheriff could see it. Sheriff Morrison squinted at the image, then looked up at Jake with surprise. "This your family? My wife Sarah and our son Daniel," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel would be about Tommy's age now. Would have been. The crowd pressed closer, straining to see. Jake held the photograph higher, letting the afternoon light illuminate the faces of a woman and a small dark-haired boy, who could have been Tommy's brother. "Cholera took them both 2 years ago," Jake continued. "I buried them on a hill overlooking our ranch. Every morning when I wake up, I see their graves from my bedroom window." Tommy looked up at him with wide eyes, and Jake saw understanding dawning in the boy's face. Not pity, but recognition, the look of someone who knew what loss felt like. "When I saw this boy standing up there, proud and scared and alone," Jake's voice broke slightly, "I saw my Daniel. I saw what he might have become if he'd lived, if he'd been left without family. I couldn't walk away." The sheriff studied the photograph for a long moment, then handed it back. That don't prove you didn't take someone else's child. No, Jake agreed. But maybe this will. He knelt down so he was eye level with Tommy. Son, I need you to tell these people the truth. Where did you come from? How did you get here? Tommy looked around at the circle of faces, all waiting for his answer. His small hands clutched his burlap sack tighter, and for a moment, Jake thought the boy might run. Instead, Tommy straightened his shoulders the same way he had on the auction block. I ran away, he said, clearly, from the orphanage in Cedar Falls. I walked for 6 days to get here. Why? The sheriff asked gently. Why run away? Tommy's chin trembled, but his voice stayed steady. Because Mr. Hartwell said nobody would ever want me. Said I was too small, too quiet, too much trouble. He said I'd probably die in that place. The crowd's mood shifted again, anger now directed at the orphanage director, rather than Jake. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. Cedar Falls is 100 miles south of Millerville, she told the sheriff. This ain't the missing boy you're looking for. Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly, then looked at Jake with new respect. Seems like you both found what you were looking for today. The crowd began to disperse, conversations shifting from suspicion to sympathy. Jake stood up, the photograph still in his hand, and looked down at Tommy. The boy was staring at the image with fascination. They look like good people, Tommy said softly. They were the best, Jake replied. Sarah always wanted a house full of children. We only got to have Daniel for 7 years, but those were the happiest years of my life. Tommy nodded as if he understood something fundamental about loss and love. Will you tell me about them sometime? Every story I can remember, Jake promised. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward and extended his hand. Sorry about the trouble, Coleman. Can't be too careful when it comes to children. Jake shook the offered hand. You were doing your job. I respect that. The sheriff tipped his hat to Tommy. You take care of yourself, boy. And if Mr. Coleman don't treat you right, you come find me. He will, Tommy said with quiet confidence that surprised everyone, including Jake. As they walked toward Jake's wagon, Tommy looked up at him. What should I call you? Jake considered the question seriously. What would you like to call me? Tommy was quiet for a moment. Could I call you Pa? Jake stopped walking. The word hit him like a physical blow, opening wounds he thought had healed, and healing others he didn't know, still bled. He looked down at this boy who had chosen him as much as he had chosen the boy, and felt something shift in his heart, not replacing what he'd lost, but making room for something new. I'd be honored, he said. They climbed into the wagon together, and as Jake urged the horses forward, Tommy settled beside him on the bench seat. The boy pulled something from his burlap sack, a small wooden horse, carved with careful hands. My real PA made this for me before he died, Tommy said. It's all I got left of him. Jake studied the carving, simple but skillfully made, worn smooth by small hands. He was a good craftsman. He was a good PA too, Tommy said. I think he would have liked you. As they rode through the gathering dusk toward the ranch, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years: hope. Not for the past to return, but for the future to hold meaning again. Years later, when Tommy was grown and had children of his own, he would tell them about the day a stranger became his father. He would speak of auction blocks and photographs, of the courage it takes to choose family when blood fails you, and of the cowboy who whispered 5 words that changed both their lives forever. He's my son now. But that evening, as they rode toward home under a sky full of stars, they were simply 2 people who had found each other exactly when they needed to. A man learning to love again, and a boy learning what it meant to be loved. Behind them, the town settled into night, but ahead lay tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, stretching out like an open road toward whatever came next. Our Wild West journey isn't stet ending. It's stet's just beginning. Click on the screen or check the pinned comment to join my new channel. Saddle up for the next adventure.